Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm very excited to be here today. My name is Brett Rosenberg. I'm a former foreign policy official in the Biden administration, and I'm very excited to be here in conversation with the one and only Dr. Rachel Myrick. We will be talking today about this truly extraordinary book, Polarization and International Politics: How Extreme Partisanship Threatens Global Stability. I cannot recommend it enough. Dr. Myrick is the Douglas and Ellen Lowy Associate Professor of Political Science at Duke University. She researches the domestic politics of international security with a focus on contemporary U.S. foreign policy. And frankly, I cannot think of many more timely topics than the title of this talk, which is How Partisanship Threatens Global Stability. There's certainly a sense in the world of some things coming undone, both here at home and around the world. And it is just an honor and privilege to be able to talk with a phenomenal scholar and a phenomenal friend in launching this extraordinary book. You know, as someone who has been a foreign policy practitioner, a political scientist, and frankly, just an American citizen, I took so much away from this, and I know you all will too. The findings are fascinating. The writing is clear and engaging, which for an academic book, that's a huge thing. Frankly, it's just timely and innovative. So I'm going to stop gushing because we really want to turn to our guest of the hour, Dr. Myrick. So Rachel, congrats on a truly incredible book. So I'd just like to kick it off with a probably deceptively simple question, which is, how did you come to this project and this topic?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Brett, for being here. It's really a privilege to be here and to be able to speak with you about this book. I think, as any casual observer of politics in the US will know, I think, just understand that polarization is a really defining characteristic of American politics right now. But I think what's been very interesting to me is that polarization isn't a new phenomenon, either in the US or elsewhere. It's been a recurrent feature of democratic politics, and it's affecting a lot of democracies worldwide, in countries in Western Europe, in Latin America, in parts of East Asia, South Asia. And so, when I started researching and thinking about this book, I noticed that there's so much work in political science on how polarization impacts domestic politics and society, but we don't really have a good understanding or appreciation for how it impacts the foreign policy making process and how it might affect national security. And I think in the US, the reason for this is that, just for a lot of the 20th century, there is some degree of bipartisan consensus around core US national security priorities. And generally speaking, a lot of foreign affairs was pretty insulated from partisan politics. But, I think I observed and we all observe that that's changing. And we want to know what's going to happen as partisan conflict extends into foreign affairs, and what sort of implications might that have more generally for democracies worldwide and how they behave in international politics. And so, just looking around, that was really the reason or the main impetus for starting on this topic.
Excellent. Well, maybe we'll take it to first principles to start with. Just, I guess first off, maybe can you summarize the main argument of the book, and then we'll pick it to pieces as we go.
Perfect. Yeah. So in a nutshell, this book is about how lots of democracies around the globe are experiencing extreme political polarization. And the argument is that this has underappreciated consequences that are largely negative for their foreign policy making. And in particular, it makes foreign policy more volatile. And it also makes democracies less likely to be credible adversaries and less reliable allies.
Awesome. I guess pretty baseline question, just how polarized are we right now?
Pretty polarized. So if we think about the US in comparative perspective, not to get too much in the weeds, but there's kind of considerable debate about how to measure polarization cross-nationally. So one thing the book spends a lot of time on is talking about these different measures, ways that political scientists have thought about comparing polarization in the US to other countries. And if you look at these measures, I think you notice a few broad descriptive trends in thinking about the US relative to its peer countries. One of them is that actually, if you look historically and kind of average polarization over the last century, the US doesn't actually look that ideologically polarized relative to other OECD countries. It's not really an outlier. It's more middling levels of polarization in the US. But another thing that these kind of descriptive statistics suggest is that since 2017, the US has been experiencing arguably more extreme forms of polarization, high levels of ideological polarization, as well as affective or social polarization. And then I think another kind of interesting thing to note in thinking about this from a cross-national perspective is that in the United States, polarization in foreign policy actually also historically has been pretty low or moderate. And so it doesn't look as polarized with respect to foreign affairs as a lot of other democracies that are our peers.
So, as you said, sort of on average, we look fairly similar to other OECD states. Today, though, you talk about we're in a moment of extreme polarization, and that spans both sort of elite policymaking and politician levels, as well as the mass public level. What are the implications of that extreme polarization?
Yeah, so I think, let me back up a bit and define what I mean by extreme polarization, and talk about, what that entails. So extreme polarization, we think of as happening when both what we term ideological polarization and affective polarization co-occur. So ideological polarization is increasing policy distance between the parties. So this idea in the US context that Democrats are moving to the left and becoming more liberal, and Republicans are moving to the right and becoming more conservative. And then affective polarization or social polarization is this idea that people are increasingly attached to their in-party and they increasingly dislike their out-party. So this is associated with processes of heightened negative partisanship or partisan animus. And so what I define extreme polarization in the book are these contexts in which both ideological and affective polarization are kind of happening at the same time. And there are a few things I think that are distinctive about these environments. For one, the stakes of winning in these sorts of environments are very high. And so it becomes this kind of winner take all dynamic. And that gives politicians incentives to tilt the playing field to their advantage. And so this is associated with processes of democratic erosion or backsliding. Another thing that's distinct about environments of extreme polarization is that they provide opportunities for ideologues and party activists to extend partisan conflict to new issue areas. So areas that hadn't previously been polarized might get pulled into that partisan divide. And this is particularly likely to happen in the context of electoral cycles. And a third distinctive aspect of these environments are that they tend to kind of weaken constraints on democratic leaders, and it becomes really hard to hold leaders accountable. And all of these kind of processes together, I think, have really important downstream implications for foreign policy, which I'm very happy to talk through.
I think that's actually a perfect segue talking about those constraints, actually, because I think you start your book by noting that political scientists have argued for a very long time that democracies have some pretty fundamental advantages for autocracies in how they conduct foreign policy, both in terms of how they're viewed by others and the sort of process at home. Can you talk a little bit about what those advantages are? And then maybe we'll go into how partisanship and polarization impacts them.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. So after the Cold War, there was this kind of broad perception that democracies had triumphed over the communist threat. And a lot of scholarship in international relations focused on this idea of the democratic advantage, this concept that democracies on average are a lot more advantaged in foreign affairs relative to non-democracies. And when you dig into it, those advantages really come from two systems of constraint that are common across democracies. So first is a system of horizontal constraints or accountability to other actors within government. So we might think about, for instance, accountability to a political opposition or an opposition party or coalition that checks the executive. And then there's also a set of vertical constraints that keeps leaders accountable to the public or to the electorate. And the combination of those two constraints, that vertical and horizontal constraints, help to produce different advantages in foreign affairs. And this book focuses on three of those advantages. First, a stability advantage, or this idea that democracies tend to have pretty consistent foreign policy over time, despite regular leadership turnover. Second is a credibility advantage, or this idea that democracies tend to be able to leverage these domestic constraints to credibly signal information abroad to foreign adversaries. And then third is a reliability advantage, or this idea that democracies can generally maintain international commitments and they're more cooperative in general in international politics. And so we can talk kind of more in depth about how polarization comes in, but the overarching idea is that extreme polarization really weakens those constraints on democratic leaders. And in turn, that undermines these advantages that democracies have when they make foreign policy. And so in that regard, we could think about this book as a sort of corrective to the democratic advantage tradition in international relations.
Great. And I think, what's interesting to me about those three advantages, the stability, credibility, reliability, is they all seem conceptually distinct but mutually reinforcing, right?
Totally.
If you have a more stable foreign policy, you will seem more credible to your adversaries, more reliable to your allies. And if these things, as I said earlier, sort of start coming undone, you can see them all getting into a pretty negative spiral pretty fast. And I guess we're really here to talk about that negative spiral. So I'd love to dig into some of the ways that polarization can corrupt those advantages and maybe look at some contemporary examples along the way. So there's definitely a sense that I think is borne out in the facts that our foreign policy is becoming more volatile, swinging from administration to administration. I certainly felt it in government. We spent a lot of time at the beginning of the Biden administration thinking about what do we need to undo from the Trump administration. And certainly the Trump administration has probably spent a lot less time and doing a lot more to undo what has been done from the Biden administration. And the Paris Agreement, the Iran deal, you can really just name it. And I guess one question is, are certain issues in foreign policy more likely to be subject to those swings than others? What determines where polarization is really gonna have some oomph over some other things?
Yeah, absolutely. So this dynamic you described, first of all, I think is very true. And the idea is generally that, like, as polarization is growing, there are more incentives for politicians to kind of appeal to more extreme voices and to try and mobilize and energize their base rather than try to persuade more moderate voters. And as affective polarization is growing, there is this incentive to kind of undo the foreign policy accomplishments of the previous administration when it was helmed by a member of the opposite party. And so I think the examples you give from government are absolutely true. In terms of the specific, issues that I think might be more prone to politicization than others, I think there are kind of a few different factors that might make an issue more vulnerable to polarization. The first are foreign policy issues that I think can be readily linked to politicized social identities. So in the United States, we often think about partisanship as an increasingly social identity insofar as it's correlated with a variety of other social identities. So race, religion, geographic region, gender. It's a lot easier to predict your partisanship based on those social identities. And those social identities kind of reinforce some of the us versus them dynamics that are common to our partisan politics today. And so when foreign affairs issues can be linked to those identities, those sorts of issues, I think, are particularly vulnerable to politicization. So one kind of concrete example of that I think we've been seeing is immigration and refugee policy, where we've been increasingly seeing that linked explicitly to racial and ethnic identity and become more pooled into the partisan divide. Another set of issues that I think are particularly prone to polarization are foreign policy issues that relate to debates around internationalism or multilateralism. So there's long been kind of this undercurrent of skepticism, as you well know, in the Republican Party around some of these principles that have animated a lot of American grand strategy historically. And I think we're seeing a recent manifestation of that in Trump's America First foreign policy agenda, and seeing this kind of recurring skepticism and these issues, I think, related in particular to global governance and to US participation in multilateral institutions, are going to increasingly become areas of scrutiny and intense partisanship, I believe. And then the last basket of issues I think are especially vulnerable to politicization are issues that are related to non-traditional security threats. So these are things that are not easily resolved with traditional hard power or military tools. And in recent decades, Democrats have tried to elevate a lot of issues to become national security priorities that are more diffuse in nature. So things like climate security, global health security, environmental security. And we've seen Republicans often push back on those efforts and more politicization of those issue areas. And I think, for instance, the polarization around the response to the COVID-19 pandemic is an example of that. So in brief, I would say, foreign affairs is less polarized, of course, than domestic policy, but you're right that there's these particular issue areas that I think are more likely to be pulled into the partisan divide. And in those areas, we should expect a greater volatility with presidential turnover.
Very, very interesting. And I think one of the points you made in the book is that there have historically been a number of things, including just less polarization, that prevent those swings. But one of them has been an understanding of non-political institutions and bureaucracies of foreign policy and national security making. I'm sure lots of people saw the president's tweeting about sending troops into Chicago in the style of Apocalypse Now. We're seeing politicization of the National Guard, of the military, of intelligence communities. How does this impact sort of the stability side of foreign policy, and how is polarization playing into this?
Yeah, I actually think that the politicization of the foreign policy bureaucracy is a really important reason why the stability advantage is being undermined. So essentially, this is not only a story about diverging preferences across the political parties, it's also a story, as you mentioned, about the weakening of these nonpartisan institutions that help to serve as a check on executive power. And so essentially what I think is happening at a high level is that polarization, provides more opportunities and more incentives for politicians to politicize the national security bureaucracy. And in the book, I actually provide a typology of different strategies that leaders use to engage in politicization. And just to point to a few examples, I think, from the Trump administration, some of which you mentioned, one is that I think arguably Trump has been engaging in this strategy of what I term transformation. So appointing ideologues to head ostensibly nonpartisan institutions, or hollowing out institutions that are not perceived as closely ideologically aligned with the president. So we've seen, for instance, the hollowing out of the State Department and the dismantling of USAID. Another strategy of politicization that you pointed out is what I refer to as a strategy of bandwagoning. like the leader associating oneself with an institution that's particularly well regarded. So in the Trump case, I think the desire to be associated with the defense establishment, with the military, right? The references to his generals, the obviously concerns right now around deployment of the National Guard, and more generally, this kind of erosion of civil-military relations. Those are all really salient examples of politicization of the national security bureaucracy. One thing I would just note, and I talk about this at length in the book, is that these types of strategies, they're not new, and there's a lot of historical examples in the book through various presidential administrations. But I think one thing that we should collectively be concerned about is that as polarization in the US increases, we're going to see more and more episodes of politicization, and it's likely that these episodes will also increase in their intensity, and that's something I think we should collectively be very concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll come back to some of these concerns in the domestic context, but one thing I want to make sure we touch on is some of these other advantages that tend to deal more with how other countries see us. And so, in addition to the stability part, you talk about one of the advantages is credibility, and how adversaries see us, that they see us as a credible negotiating partner or foe, or however you define it in a particular context, but that we are credible in the threats that we make. You write about how extreme polarization can actually erode that credibility. What are other countries looking at in our domestic democratic environment when they're sizing us up at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of this interesting general concern. So just to provide some context, the idea behind the credibility advantage is that democracies are able to leverage domestic politics to be able to signal information abroad. And so in this case, to be able to credibly issue threats to adversaries. So during a crisis, for instance, we would traditionally hope or expect Republicans and Democrats to kind of set aside their partisan politics and present a unified front to an adversary. And that provides a particularly credible signal that makes America a particularly formidable foe. But the general concern is that as polarization increases, of course, these opportunities for bipartisan consensus are going to be more and more rare. And that initial response could kind of quickly be politicized, even if it is bipartisan at first. And so I think this is something that adversaries are certainly taking note of. So I think about, for instance, this really interesting kind of fleeting moment of bipartisanship in early 2022 around the Biden administration's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So polling in March 2022 essentially showed that Americans widely perceived, Russia to be the aggressor and widely supported Ukraine. And actually, there was pretty broad bipartisan support for the Biden administration's initial response. But as you may recall, right, what was kind of interesting there was that to the extent Republicans disapproved of the Biden administration's response, it was actually the criticism was more so that the Biden administration wasn't really doing enough for Ukraine. But what happened is that consensus very quickly unraveled. In large part, I think, due to some prominent voices on the right who raised questions about US security commitments. And this topic became really politicized. And so I think that sort of anecdote illustrates how responses to crises are likely to grow increasingly partisan, even if there is this initial moment of bipartisan consensus. And that's going to hinder our collective readiness to kind of tackle new threats. And I think adversaries are certainly looking at that and perhaps opportunistically taking advantage of that.
I think that the Ukraine case is a really interesting one because, as you said, there was actually a vanishingly rare moment of bipartisan consensus. One of the examples that you give that I found really fascinating and would love to ask you more about is the example of the Obama administration trying to get the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and the ways in which politics fed into the negotiations And basically the decision to make an executive-driven agreement because they didn't actually think there was a chance to get a treaty, which would require bipartisan support. How do you see that as sort of emblematic of this moment that we might see,
Yeah.
we are in now?
Yeah, so I think this is a really kind of interesting case, and it was actually one of the motivating cases for embarking on this project as I was watching some of these dynamics unfold during the negotiation process. And then ultimately that process culminated in 2015. And I think I went to DC one summer and spent some time interviewing folks who worked on the negotiation or were on the Hill during that time. And I think, one interesting thing that I kept hearing was there was a moment quite early in the process where the Obama administration actually anticipated that moderate Republicans would come support some sort of deal, and that would actually give the U.S. quite a bit more leverage in negotiating this agreement. But for a variety of reasons, in part because it got kind of swept up in the 2016 Republican presidential primary, the topic of U.S.-Iran relations became really politicized during this period. And as a consequence, the Obama administration kind of sought increasingly ways to box out Congress. And there was this environment of mutual mistrust that was created. And so we might think about a counterfactual, less polarized environment in which the Obama administration might perhaps have been able to leverage moderate Republicans and negotiate that agreement as an international treaty. And perhaps that might have been more durable in the long term. And so I think a lot of, those counterfactuals are obviously hard to speculate about, but a lot of, interesting dynamics around politicization of that deal, I think more broadly illustrate the challenges with trying to tackle or initiate these kind of complex negotiations with adversaries in a highly polarized domestic environment.
And I think a coda to that was there's a moment where it looked like the Trump administration might revive the deal a few months ago. And I heard a number of Democrats in the foreign policy world saying, I don't know about this. And that to me was like such a good example of affective polarization, right? The wrong team was doing the right policy, and it may be in the wrong way. But it was a real tribal team moment that was truly fascinating to watch, and an illustrative example, I think, of what you're talking about.
Yes, just quickly on that point, I do have some survey data in the book that essentially randomizes whether President Trump, or at the time Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris, kind of endorsed a particular policy or embarked on a negotiation with an adversary. And you see those partisan dynamics really play out in public opinion data, that people are willing to take a particular policy response if it's endorsed by their own party, but not by the opposition party. And so that's kind of just speaking to some of that tangible evidence around those partisan biases.
Yeah, I think editorially that affective polarization terrifies me even more than the ideological polarization. It just feels hard to break through as humans. But we'll come back to what to do about it at the end. First, let's deal with some more problems, which is the third democratic advantage that you talk about is not just about how adversaries see us as credible or not, but how allies and partners see us as reliable. What are the impacts of extreme polarization on the U.S. being seen as a reliable partner? How are our allies looking at what's going on here?
Yeah, so the fundamental reason for the reliability advantage is that in democracies, international commitments, major agreements that are made require some sort of buy-in from the public or from a political opposition. So that might be some sort of referendum or, of course, a ratification process for an agreement. And that means that democracies are pretty selective about the agreements that they enter. But once they do enter them, we would expect them to be more durable agreements. And so the fundamental issue with polarization is that as polarization grows, these constraints on democratic leaders weaken. And these leaders are now more able and willing to act unilaterally without the buy-in from those domestic actors. And so, that, for instance, makes it more likely that leaders might renege on agreements when they simply benefit their own short-term interests. And it also means that more agreements might be made without bipartisan support, and as a result, be less durable. And so, in the U.S. context, the way that this comes into play very tangibly is through the increasing use of executive agreements or non-binding political commitments rather than the use of the treaty ratification process, of course, in the Senate. And so the book goes through some of the descriptive patterns around those trends. But as you mentioned earlier in the call, we see lots of just examples of this from the current administration, of President Trump withdrawing the US from a variety of multilateral institutions. So things like the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And I think the downstream consequence of that is that's contributing to this perception that the US is increasingly unreliable, and is making allies and partners potentially look elsewhere for global leadership, which could be, I think, a bit scary to think about down the line.
Yeah, I think just anecdotally, speaking with foreign counterparts and things like that, they have started to bake in that we are not going to necessarily hold to our commitments anymore, which is a pretty wild thing to hear from government
Right.
counterparts.
And how are you supposed to engage in long-term planning, right? If it's
Right.
hard to predict whether the next administration is going to renege. And so I think this creates all sorts of really big challenges for global governance.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to take us away from the US for 1 second. We'll come back. Because you talked at the beginning, this is not specifically about the Trump administration. In fact, you have a preface that I wonder if you had to add pretty close to the end, saying this isn't just about Trump. This actually applies very broadly throughout time, but it also applies outside of the US. And I was in Taiwan recently for some meetings that should have been about the US-Taiwan relationship and about how Taiwan views China. And the number one issue that rose to the top in nearly every meeting with both the party in power and the opposition party was polarization, and the ways in which polarization was impacting their views on China and even their ability to respond to a sort of cross-strait crisis. And how it was frankly warping their own foreign policy and civil defense and sort of every form of debate that they had. So how you have a whole section in your book actually about democracies in general outside of the US. How do these findings apply in this moment? And how much of an outlier are we right now?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the overarching idea here applies quite broadly, right? This idea that polarization weakens constraints, and that could be not only political polarization, but other forms of social polarization, and that the weakening of constraints is largely a bad thing for foreign policy making. And so we can think about lots of different examples historically and also from a contemporary context about how polarization is affecting lots of different countries' foreign policy making processes. And so Taiwan, I think, is a particularly interesting case, but we could also think about polarization around foreign policy being sort of central to the partisan divide in South Korea, partisan politics playing a big role in Israel in terms of crisis response. And so I think there are some countries where foreign policy rather is more central to the partisan cleavage to begin with, such that increasing polarization is actually making these problems even worse. What we're seeing in the US context is foreign affairs being increasingly pulled into the partisan divide. And so while the book is primarily focused on US foreign policy, that's largely because the fleshing out the arguments requires grounding in a specific institutional context. And I think, for instance, it's hard to talk about the reliability of US commitments without bringing into it the idiosyncrasies of like the treaty making process in the US. And so there are lots of interesting opportunities and avenues for extension to other contexts cross-nationally. But I think we're doing so really requires carefully thinking about how these dynamics might play out given given a particular party structure or given a particular governmental system or institutional context or electoral system, and thinking about how that might filter down and affect the foreign policy making process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You have one map in this book that I found particularly terrifying, where you have a global map, and the countries where it is more polarized than previously are darker, and those where it's less polarized are lighter, and it's much darker around the world.
Right.
Which I think brings me maybe to the sort of final section of questioning, which is, you note in your introduction, actually, that this book is not intended to be a dire warning for democracies, which I appreciated because, my goodness, it's a sobering read. And I guess for the first sort of maybe odd question with that is, are there any benefits to polarization in foreign policy making? Because, for example, I mean, contestation over different ideologies between different camps that really believe in what they think, that's the stuff democracy is made of. And that, I would argue, for a long time, we actually didn't have enough of, democratic responsibility in foreign policy. And we want people arguing their sides and coming to good conclusions together. So are there any silver linings to this pretty hefty cloud?
Yeah. Yeah, I really think they are. And I think you're exactly right. So I think there's been a lot of times historically where there's too much agreement, in particular in US national security policy, and that partisan disagreement might be a good thing. So let me maybe talk through, where I think partisan disagreement can be a good thing, and then why I think our current form of partisan disagreement is not a good thing. So where partisan disagreement can be a good thing, for one, as you mentioned, it might just simply reflect like a diverse marketplace of ideas. And we should be having these challenging policy disagreements and discussions about what role the US should play in the world, especially at this really pivotal political moment. And so to the extent that polarization in foreign policy reflects that divergence of opinion and that sort of principled discussion, that's certainly a good thing, right? And another way that I think partisan disagreement can be good, which is also related to something you alluded to, is that a common pathology that's plagued the national security establishment historically has been kind of excessive groupthink, and almost like too much bipartisan consensus around some issues, that has sort of prevented the US from deviating from the status quo. So I think one example of this is that some people believe the US has relied too much on military tools to achieve foreign policy objectives. And you could argue that's in part because there's been kind of a lot of bipartisan consensus around defense policy, and the defense budget. And so if you believe that, then maybe polarization is positive in indicating a deviation from that status quo, or rethinking of that consensus. And then I think a last reason partisan disagreement might be good is that more polarized polity is like a more engaged polity. So to the extent that polarization in foreign policy reduces apathy on foreign affairs among voters, that's certainly a positive thing. And I'm often kind of struck by the extent to which we don't talk as much about foreign policy as perhaps we should in presidential elections, especially because the president has so much latitude in foreign affairs relative to domestic policy. So those are some reasons why I think disagreement can be good, but and I think what you point out, that political contestation, is an essential piece of healthy democracy, is so crucial. But I would draw this distinction between what I think of as this kind of substantive policy disagreement and this purely partisan disagreement. And what I think we're observing often now, not all the times, but often, is not a really deep, rich debate about the future of American grand strategy. And in fact, a lot of these partisan antics are kind of crowding out those debates or making them feel more superficial. So want to draw that distinction between that kind of substantive disagreement and that partisan disagreement.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Twitter seems like a very healthy place right
A
now.
perfectly healthy place for dialogue.
But I agree, and I think this comes back to my comment earlier that the affective polarization actually terrifies me the most because I think it is the thing that is causing this knee-jerk um, sort of dukes up approach, as opposed to there's some real big problems and real big debates in U.S. foreign policy that we need to be having healthy democratic debate around,
Totally.
because we can have lots of substantive disagreements about where we're going. Um, I think one potential positive that some analysts have pointed to, uh, and one that I've been sort of exploring and actually disagree with, and would be curious if you agree or disagree, is some say that we might be able to lower polarization in the US with a really great external threat, right? That we could come together in the way that we did in the Cold War. There were lower levels of polarization in foreign policy than there are today. And maybe today, if we were to all rally around defeating a common adversary, most likely China, then actually we could potentially break through some of this partisan rancor. Do you think it's possible to create more partisan unity in that way? Is that the most likely outcome? Where do you think that might go?
Yeah. So I think this is a really fascinating question, and it's the subject of another line of projects that I'm working on that I became interested in precisely because it's kind of an outgrowth of this question about how polarization and foreign policy interact. So you're right that I think I've encountered this narrative quite a lot, that there's this perception that if the US were to have an orienting enemy like it did during the Cold War, that this might reduce polarization in foreign policy or maybe even reduce polarization more widely. And I think, at first glance, right now, this is often, I think, applied to the rise of China and the perception that that will generate some sort of bipartisan consensus. And I guess I would say I'm generally skeptical of this overarching argument for two reasons. Um, One is that if you look at the historical record, which I've done in an article previously, and you look historically at how the U.S. responded domestically to major security crises, one thing you'll notice is that like what tends to happen is that the response to the crisis tends to reflect domestic politics. So new threats or crises that arise during less partisan times are less likely to be polarized, whereas when they arise during more partisan times, they're more readily politicized. And so I think it's hard, for instance, to imagine a situation in which we're a cross-strait crisis to occur with respect to Taiwan, that wouldn't create a lot of politicization in Washington. I don't necessarily think there would be kind of natural unity around those questions just because there's such deep mistrust between the different parties in the United States. The other reason why I'm just generally, I think, more skeptical of this argument is that I think we shouldn't be looking to foreign actors to resolve our domestic political problems. As you well know, and I know from your work on threat politics, right, there are a lot of harms that might come from amplifying foreign threats. And we should be very cognizant of that type of strategy backfiring. So I think I'm skeptical about this idea that a new orienting enemy like China will inherently be unifying in American politics.
Yeah, I mean, I share your skepticism as we've discussed, and I think actually the example you gave earlier of the Ukraine moment, of there was this fleeting moment of bipartisan accord that very quickly devolved into sort of a partisan fistfight that we obviously is continuing in different iterations and shapes in this moment. So, given there seem to be very few silver linings to this cloud, and given these national security challenges that are brought out by this form of extreme polarization, what do we do? Where do we go? And maybe we can just start. What does the current political science research actually say about prospects for reducing polarization?
Yeah. So first off, if I had a clean cut silver
Yeah.
bullet answer to this question, I would be, I think, in a very important position in government, which I'm not.
I would still
uh,
put you in a very important position in government, but
which
that
is
would be
to
a nice one.
say, this is such a hard problem, and a lot of people have puzzled over this. So I'll do my best to kind of summarize a few different buckets of strategies and broadly what I think we have learned from them. The first bucket of strategies I talk a little bit about in the book is this idea that, maybe we can't save domestic politics from polarization, but maybe we can do certain things that insulate partisan politics, that insulate rather a foreign policy from partisan politics. And so a couple of ideas in that vein. I mean, I think a lot of people have written about building cross-partisan legislative coalitions in various domains of foreign affairs where there is still a good deal of bipartisan agreement. So I'm thinking in particular of areas like condemnation of human rights abuses from foreign actors, or there's a lot of bipartisan consensus around different tools of economic coercion, a lot of consensus around policies related to economic and technological competitiveness, the potential for some consensus around asserting congressional authority more in different domains of foreign policy. So I think unlike in domestic policy where so many aspects are so deeply partisan, there are opportunities for bridge building in foreign affairs, which should make us, maybe feel a little bit more optimistic. Another strategy within that bucket, I think, are reforms to try and strengthen the resilience or the nonpartisan nature of our national security institutions. So I have some colleagues who are writing about ways to reinvigorate the nonpartisan identity of the military, to promote more education around civil military relations. Lots of interesting research on reforms to reinvigorate the Foreign Service or rebuild the State Department, elevate the prestige of careers in diplomacy. But these sorts of things, I think there's lots of good ideas out there. It's just a tall order right now when that's not so clearly not a priority of the current administration. The second bucket of strategies that political scientists have written a lot about, and these feature quite often in popular commentary, are just general strategies to reduce congressional polarization, with the idea that, like, if you reduce congressional polarization, then you will strengthen that as a horizontal constraint on the president, and that will have downstream positive implications for foreign policy. And so some solutions in this vein that have been proposed, a lot of them are large scale reforms. So these are things like, should we overhaul our electoral system, or should we change our primary system? Should we try to reduce money in politics? Should we impose term limits rather? I would say on the whole, not to paint too broad of a brush, but on the whole, political scientists have been pretty critical, I think, of some of these larger institutional solutions, and in showing that there is not a great deal of evidence that they would necessarily immediately reduce congressional polarization. And in fact, I think a number of researchers have been trying to draw attention to lesser known solutions. So things like making running for office more attractive to attract more moderate, higher quality candidates, or doing some reforms to improve interpersonal interactions in DC to help build those cross-partisan coalitions. And then the third bucket of strategies that you're probably interested in are these strategies to reduce affective polarization, because again, the idea is, if you can strengthen constraints, if you can strengthen vertical constraints in this case, or electoral accountability, then that will also potentially have a positive impact on foreign policy. And in this vein, there's been lots of interesting research and some interesting, promising interventions to reduce interpersonal affective polarization. But the bigger issue is the challenges of kind of scaling some of those interventions. And in particular, a lot of those interventions might require rethinking of the social media ecosystem, which is fundamentally quite hard to do. So lots of interesting ideas out there. There's a chapter in the book that kind of addresses a lot of them, and tries to summarize some of the current interesting literature in this space. But unfortunately, no one silver bullet solution.
Well, I thought we might solve it in this hour, but these are some good steps that we can pursue in the next. Which brings me, I think, to my final question, which is this is a truly immense work of scholarship, and I really hope that people take a look at it, engage with the arguments, and really spend time with it. And while I hope that my answer to this question I'm about to ask you is that you're going to take a very long nap, what's next for you? What are you working on? Where are you?
No time for napping because I have a small toddler. But what's next for research? So I think that a variety of different projects, but the big next second project in this vein is a little bit related to what we talked about earlier. So as I've been exploring this question for this project about how domestic polarization has affected foreign policy making, I've gotten really interested in this reverse relationship about how the international system is in turn affecting patterns of domestic polarization. And in particular, I'm interested in exploring this question about the extent to which security threats can be unifying or divisive and the conditions under which that might happen. So we talked a little bit earlier about the China threat case. So that's certainly one case that I'm interested in working on, but I'm planning to extend the project far beyond that case and do a kind of big exploration in a variety of different most likely cases in which we might expect security threats to generate partisan unity and see whether they did or not and what we can learn from those.
Incredible. Rachel, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you to 92NY for hosting us, and everybody should go out and read Polarization and International Politics. It's truly awesome.
Thank you.